They told him to keep driving. His team warned him it wasn't safe. But when Bryan Cranston saw an elderly woman on the street holding a cardboard sign, something in his heart told him he couldn't ignore her. What happened next would change thousands of lives forever. We've all seen it before, a homeless person standing on the sidewalk, holding a sign, begging for help. Most people walk past, pretending not to notice. But one day, Bryan Cranston didn't. That one decision, to stop, to listen, to care, set off a chain reaction that would grow beyond anything he could have imagined. The woman's name was Martha. Her story was heartbreaking. But what Bryan Cranston did after meeting her, that's what turned this moment into a world-changing movement. It was the kind of summer day where the heat wasn't just unbearable, it was oppressive. The kind that made the air shimmer over the asphalt like a mirage, distorting the view of the world. The pavement radiated heat like an oven, and every breath felt thick and heavy, as if the very air had turned into a suffocating blanket of warmth. The city moved at its usual frantic pace, people rushing past each other, their faces set in expressions of mild irritation and exhaustion. Some clutched cold drinks, beads of condensation rolling down plastic cups, offering brief relief from the sun's relentless assault. Others hurried into taxis or darted into air-conditioned cafes, eager to escape the overwhelming heat. To them, this was just another day. But for one person, there was no escape. At the corner of a bustling intersection, an elderly woman stood, alone in the middle of the chaos. The world moved around her, but no one truly saw her. Her clothes, once neat, were now worn and frayed, faded by time and hardship. A simple, thin shawl covered her shoulders, though it offered no real protection from the scorching sun. Sweat glistened on her forehead, her frail body trembling, not just from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something that had been weighing her down for months, perhaps years. In her fragile hands, she held a cardboard sign. Its edges were curled and brittle from the relentless sun, the ink fading, as if the words themselves were fighting to stay visible. But they were still legible, still carrying the weight of her desperation. "Please help me. My granddaughter needs a miracle." Most people didn't stop. Some stole quick glances at her sign, their eyes flickering with a momentary flash of recognition before they looked away. Others walked past, their gazes glued to their phones, headphones in, as if deliberately tuning out the world and her pain. A few kind souls tossed loose change into the small cup by her feet, their hands moving quickly, almost reflexively, as if they believed that dropping a few coins would absolve them of guilt. They never stopped, never asked, never listened. She was invisible. She had been invisible for a long time. A few cars away, Bryan Cranston sat in the backseat of his black SUV. The air conditioning hummed softly, keeping the inside cool and comfortable, a stark contrast to the scorching world outside. He barely noticed the slow-moving traffic. His mind was occupied with the meeting he was heading to, the influential people he would be seeing, the commitments on his schedule. But then something caught his eye. The car inched forward, and through the tinted glass he saw her. The way she stood, the weight of her struggle etched into the slump of her shoulders, the quiet despair in her eyes as people hurried past her. It did something to him. Something inside Bryan clenched. How many people had walked by her today? This week, this year? How many people had seen that sign and kept walking? His fingers drummed against the leather seat as he leaned forward. "Stop the car." The driver hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror. His security team instantly stiffened. "Sir, we need to keep moving. It's not safe to stop here. We're already behind schedule." Their voices blended into the background. Bryan wasn't listening. His gaze remained locked on the woman, his instincts screaming that this moment, this woman was different. "Open the door," he ordered. His bodyguards exchanged uneasy glances, but after a moment's hesitation, the door was unlocked. As it swung open, the heat rushed in. The smell of the city, the sound of honking cars, hurried footsteps, the occasional snippets of conversation. Bryan stepped out, the sudden shift from cold air to blistering heat hitting him instantly, but he barely noticed. His eyes were focused on her. The woman sensed movement and looked up, startled. Her grip on the cardboard sign tightened. No one had stopped before. Not like this. A conversation that changed everything. Bryan walked toward her. The world around him blurred. The traffic, the people, the voices, all of it faded. He knelt down, his eyes meeting hers. "What miracle does your granddaughter need?" His voice was gentle but firm, the kind of voice that meant he truly wanted to know the answer. The woman's lip trembled, as if no one had ever asked her that before. Her hands shook as she gripped the sign even tighter, her knuckles pale. "My name is Martha," she whispered, her voice hoarse, brittle from dehydration and months, maybe years, of hardship. She swallowed, struggling to find the strength to speak. "My granddaughter's name is Emma. She's 7 years old. Her parents, my son and daughter-in-law, died in a flood." Bryan felt his chest tighten. "I tried to take care of her, but we lost everything," Martha continued. "Our house, our savings. We've been living on the streets for months." Her voice broke. "Emma is all I have left," she sniffed, blinking rapidly, trying to hold back tears that she had probably already shed 1,000 times. "She's so smart," she said, almost smiling for a fleeting second. "She loves books. She loves to learn." But then, as if reality slammed back down onto her shoulders, her smile vanished. Her eyes filled with something worse than sadness, hopelessness. "But I can't even give her a bed to sleep in," she murmured. I don't want her to grow up believing the world doesn't care about her." Bryan swallowed hard. He looked around, the streets bustling with people too busy to notice, too distracted to stop. How many of them had walked past her? How many of them had ignored her pain? He glanced down at the small, mostly empty cup at her feet. A few crumpled dollar bills, some loose change. It wasn't enough, not even close. And then, Martha said something that stopped Bryan's heart. "I just need someone to listen," she whispered. "Just one person." Bryan exhaled, his throat tightening. His voice came out, steady, but there was an unshakable certainty behind it. "You've got someone now." He looked her in the eyes. "Let's go see Emma." Martha blinked, disbelief flickering across her face. You mean right now?" Bryan nodded. "Right now." His security team shifted uneasily. Their radios crackled as they whispered to each other, already thinking about logistics, about safety concerns. But Bryan didn't care. He had already made up his mind. As they walked, Martha led him through a maze of narrow alleyways, broken-down cars, and abandoned storefronts. The deeper they went, the heavier Bryan's heart became. This wasn't just one woman's struggle. This was an entire community that had been left behind. When they finally arrived at her home, Bryan felt something in his chest twist painfully. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter, barely standing. Nothing but plastic sheets, wooden planks, and old fabric tied together to keep the elements out. And inside, a tiny girl with tangled hair and wide, knowing eyes sat curled up on a thin blanket, hugging a tattered book to her chest. When she saw Martha, she jumped up, running into her arms. Martha whispered, her voice trembling, "It's okay, baby." Someone finally stopped to listen. Bryan felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just about Emma. This wasn't just about Martha. This was about every person in this world who had been left behind, and he wasn't going to walk away. Bryan Cranston had seen poverty before. He had read about it in newspapers, watched documentaries about homelessness, donated to charities that promised to make a difference. He had even visited shelters and shaken hands with struggling families. But standing there in the middle of a crumbling alleyway, looking at Emma's fragile shelter, the dirt beneath her tiny feet, and the emptiness in her young eyes, he realized something unsettling. It's different when you're face to face with it. This wasn't just a statistic. This wasn't just another heartbreaking story on the news. This was real. His security team stood behind him, shifting uncomfortably, their radios crackling as they exchanged quiet, anxious murmurs. Their job was to keep him safe, to get him out of here quickly. But Bryan wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't concerned about his safety. He was concerned about Martha, about Emma, about the hundreds, maybe thousands of people living like this, invisible to the world. Bryan crouched down to Emma's level, offering a small, reassuring smile. She was so small, too small to have already known so much pain. "Hi there," he said softly. "What's your name?" The little girl hesitated, her fingers gripping the edges of the worn-out book in her hands. She looked up at him, her big eyes full of hesitation, but also curiosity. "Emma," she whispered. Her voice was soft, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be talking to him at all. Bryan nodded. "That's a beautiful name." He glanced at the book she was holding. Its cover was faded, its pages frayed from years of wear. It had clearly been read over and over again. "What are you reading, sir?" he asked. Emma hesitated for a moment before slowly turning the book toward him. "It's an old school book," she admitted. Her tiny fingers ran over the torn edges of the pages. "I try to teach myself," she said, her voice small but filled with quiet determination. "Grandma says learning will help us find a better life." Bryan felt something deep in his chest tighten. This child who had lost everything was still holding on to hope. She had no home, no bed, no toys, but she had a book, and she was clinging to it like it was the last bit of light in the darkness. He turned to Martha, the elderly woman who had been fighting every day to give this little girl a future. His mind was racing. This wasn't just about giving them money. It wasn't about charity. This was about something bigger, something that could change lives. Bryan stood up. His voice was firm, unwavering. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Right now." Bryan didn't go home that night. Instead, he spent hours on the phone, reaching out to everyone he knew who could make a difference. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the first team arrived. Doctors and nurses were sent in to provide free medical checkups, not just for Martha and Emma, but for everyone in the area. Social workers began documenting the number of homeless families, working tirelessly to find them shelter. Volunteers arrived with food, clean water, and warm blankets, ensuring that no one went to bed hungry that night. And just like that, everything changed. Word spread quickly. Something was happening. By the end of the week, Bryan Cranston's small act of kindness, his decision to stop for a woman holding a cardboard sign, had turned into a full-fledged mission. 1 week later, Bryan returned. This time, he wasn't alone. Construction workers, engineers, and architects arrived at the site, ready to build something permanent. The media caught wind of the story. Soon, organizations and charities stepped forward, wanting to help. It started with temporary housing. Families who had spent years in makeshift shelters, living under tarps and scrap wood, were finally given a place to sleep. Then came the medical help. A mobile medical clinic was built. People who had never seen a doctor before now had access to free healthcare. And finally, the education center was opened. Emma, who once tried to teach herself, was now sitting in a classroom with real teachers. But then something unexpected happened. Despite being one of the youngest children in the community, Emma did something that shocked everyone. She became a teacher. She started helping other kids learn, teaching them what she had learned from her worn-out book. One of the volunteers noticed and asked her, "Why are you doing this?" Emma's answer stunned everyone. "Because someone stopped to help me. Now I want to help them." Bryan Cranston saw this and realized something crucial. This wasn't just about survival. This was about rebuilding dignity, about hope, about opportunity. What started as one moment, a decision to stop for a woman holding a sign, had now become something much bigger. They called it Hope for the Forgotten. It wasn't just about giving people food and shelter. It was about giving them a future. And it didn't stop there. The story went viral. More and more people wanted to help. In the South, families affected by hurricanes received safe housing. In the Midwest, homeless veterans were given training and job opportunities. In the West, entire schools were built in remote towns where children had never had access to education. People started believing again. Weeks turned into months. And as the movement grew, so did its impact. Bryan Cranston didn't just donate money. He was there, on the ground, talking to families, visiting shelters, ensuring that the help was real and lasting. For the first time, communities that had been ignored for decades were being rebuilt, brick by brick. Months later, Bryan stood on a stage at an event honoring the movement's success. Thousands of people had gathered, volunteers, survivors, supporters, even government officials. And that night, Emma took the stage. The same little girl who once clutched a tattered book in a broken-down shelter was now standing in front of thousands. She took a deep breath and said, "I was just a kid with a cardboard sign. But because people listened, we weren't alone anymore." The crowd erupted into applause. Bryan, standing beside Martha, looked out at the sea of people, at the lives that had been changed, and he realized this was just the beginning. The night of the event had arrived. The anticipation in the air was palpable, electric. It buzzed through the enormous hall like a current, a hum of whispered conversations and quiet excitement. Thousands of people had gathered, their eyes trained on the brightly lit stage, their hearts pounding in sync with the energy of the moment. This wasn't just another fundraiser. This wasn't just a night of celebration. It was a testament to the power of one small act of kindness. In the front rows sat families who had once been homeless, forgotten, invisible to society. Veterans who had been discarded after serving their country but had now found a second chance. Children who had once begged on the streets for scraps but now sat tall, dressed in neatly pressed school uniforms, their futures bright and filled with possibility. They were all here because of one decision, one choice Bryan Cranston had made on a scorching afternoon, to stop for an elderly woman holding a simple cardboard sign. Now, months later, the impact of that moment stretched beyond what anyone could have imagined. The lights dimmed slightly, and the massive screen behind the stage flickered to life. A montage began playing, images of before and after. A filthy, crumbling alleyway replaced with a thriving community. Children once barefoot and hopeless, now running across schoolyards, books in hand. Families once huddled under makeshift shelters, now unlocking the doors to real homes. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the transformations unfolded on the screen. There were moments of resilience and triumph. The footage showed Emma in her old tattered dress, curled up in a fragile shelter, clutching her worn-out school book. Then it cut to her today, standing tall, confident, no longer a child struggling to survive, but a young girl with a voice. Backstage, Bryan Cranston watched in silence. His chest tightened, his throat thick with emotion. He had been there for every step of this journey. He had seen the pain, the despair. He had held the hands of those who had lost everything. But tonight, this night wasn't about him. It was about something far bigger than any one person. A deep voice echoed through the speakers, booming over the expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the studio, Emma." A voice that would be heard. The room went still. The audience hushed. Then, from the shadows of the room, a small figure emerged. Emma. She was no longer the frightened little girl Bryan had met in a makeshift shelter. She was something more now. Dressed in a simple, neatly pressed dress, she walked onto the stage with quiet confidence. The bright lights reflected off her youthful face, her eyes scanning the sea of people before her. The same child who had once been invisible to the world now stood before thousands, a symbol of something greater than herself. She hesitated for just a second. The microphone trembled in her small hands. She took a breath, and then she spoke. "I was just a kid with a cardboard sign," she said, her voice clear, strong, unwavering. But because someone stopped to listen, we weren't alone anymore. The hall was silent. For one heart-stopping moment, it felt as if the world had paused. Then the applause erupted, loud, thunderous, unstoppable. The kind of applause that fills your chest, swells your heart, and makes your breath catch. People stood to their feet, clapping until their hands ached. Some wiped away tears, overcome by the raw, undeniable truth in Emma's words. From the front row, Martha, Emma's frail, devoted grandmother, clasped her hands together, her eyes brimming with tears of pride. Bryan glanced at Martha and saw the depth of emotion on her face. She leaned in close to Emma and whispered, her voice trembling, "Did you ever think your sign would lead to this?" Emma turned to her grandmother, her young face glowing with something stronger than just happiness. Determination. "It wasn't the sign, Grandma," she said softly, her gaze steady. "It was the kindness of those who stopped to listen." A monument to hope. Months later, another major event was held, but this time it wasn't in a grand hall. It was outside, on the land where Martha and Emma's slum had once stood. The air was different here. The streets that had once been piles of trash and hopelessness were now paved with bricks, lined with streetlights that cast a warm glow at night. The makeshift shelters, the thin plastic walls, the wooden scraps held together with rope, were gone. In their place stood real homes, small but strong, painted in soft, welcoming colors. At the center of it all was a school, and just beyond that, a playground, where children who had once only known struggle now laughed freely. But at the very heart of it all stood something more, a monument. Carved from solid stone, standing tall against the skyline, it depicted a young girl holding her grandmother's hand. The figures looked ahead, not down, not broken, but forward, toward the future. At the base of the monument, engraved in bold, powerful letters, were the words, "Hope begins in the smallest places." Bryan Cranston stood beside Martha and Emma, watching as the crowd gathered for the unveiling. Emma reached out and traced her fingers across the engraved words. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. She turned to Bryan and whispered, "Does this mean no one else will have to go through what we did?" Bryan took a deep breath. His voice was soft but resolute. "It means we'll never stop trying to make sure of that." A movement that would not stop. But this wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of something far bigger than anyone had expected. Inspired by the transformation of one small community, people across the country began taking action. In the South, families recovering from natural disasters received housing and aid. In the Midwest, homeless veterans were provided with mental health care and job training. In the West, schools were built in remote villages where children once had to walk miles to receive an education. And it didn't stop there. Organizations and philanthropists stepped forward, expanding the movement worldwide. In Africa, Clean water projects brought fresh drinking water to villages for the first time. In South America, farming initiatives gave struggling families a way to become self-sufficient. In war-torn regions, medical teams were sent in to provide aid to those who had never seen a doctor in their lives. Hope for the forgotten had become a global force. The legacy lives on years past. Emma, now a young woman, no longer needed to hold a cardboard sign to be heard. She had become a voice for millions. And Bryan? He never let go of the mission. One evening, Emma and Bryan returned to the monument. Martha, now older and more fragile, sat on a nearby bench watching the children play. Emma exhaled deeply. "I can't believe this all started with a cardboard sign," she murmured. Bryan placed a hand on her shoulder. "It started with more than that." Emma turned to him. "With what?" "With the courage to believe that one person can make a difference." Emma smiled. "Then we can't stop now." Bryan nodded. "No, Emma, we won't." The transformation was undeniable. What had once been a forgotten slum, a place where people struggled to survive rather than live, had now blossomed into a thriving community. The narrow, uneven dirt paths that once wound between makeshift shelters were now paved streets, lined with real homes, small but strong, painted in soft, welcoming colors. Streetlights illuminated the roads at night, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Children who had once spent their days scavenging for food, dodging danger, and fighting to stay warm were now running freely, laughing as they played in a brand new park. Their giggles echoed through the air, a sound that had once been unheard in these streets. At the heart of it all, standing tall as a symbol of resilience, hope, and kindness, was the monument. It was carved from stone, its details finely chiseled to capture the unwavering strength of a young girl holding her grandmother's hand, looking ahead toward the future. The girl's face was not filled with sorrow or despair, but with quiet determination. It was a permanent reminder of how far they had come, a beacon of hope for every struggling family, every lost soul, every forgotten person who had ever believed the world had turned its back on them. But this wasn't just about one neighborhood. What had started with a single act of kindness, Bryan Cranston stopping for one woman holding a simple cardboard sign, had ignited something far greater. The world had been watching. As news of their success spread, people across the country, and even across the world, were inspired to join the mission. In the South, communities devastated by hurricanes and floods were rebuilt with homes strong enough to withstand future storms. Families who had once lost everything were given a second chance. In the Midwest, homeless veterans who had spent years battling both the streets and their past were given the stable housing and job training programs. They weren't just being helped, they were being given the tools to rebuild their lives. In the West, schools were built in remote areas, ensuring that no child was forced to give up on an education simply because of where they were born. But the movement didn't stop at the country's borders. It became a worldwide effort. In Africa, entire villages that had never known the taste of clean drinking water now had sustainable water purification projects, ensuring that no child had to drink from a contaminated well again. In South America, farming communities were given seeds, resources, and training to grow their own food, breaking the cycle of poverty that had held them hostage for generations. In war-torn regions, mobile medical teams were sent into areas where hospitals no longer existed. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen a doctor. The initiative expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined. It was no longer about helping just one family. It was about changing the way the world viewed poverty, hardship, and suffering. For too long, the world had seen people like Martha and Emma as statistics, numbers on a page, a nameless problem that no one could fix. But Bryan Cranston, Emma, and every person who joined the movement had proved something important. People aren't statistics. They're stories waiting to be heard. Years passed. Emma never forgot where she came from. The little girl who had once stood on a street corner, clutching a worn-out book and a cardboard sign, had grown into a powerful young woman. She traveled the world, speaking to leaders, activists, and everyday people about the power of small acts of kindness. She had once been invisible. Now she was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one is too small to make a difference. And Bryan? He never let go of the mission. He continued working behind the scenes, ensuring that the impact of the movement was permanent, not just temporary. He fought to make sure that help wasn't just given, but that real, lasting change was created. One day, Emma and Bryan returned to the monument. Martha, now older, her frail hands resting gently on her lap, sat on a nearby bench, watching the children play in the park. She had lived to see the very world she had once prayed Emma would have. Emma looked up at the statue of herself as a child, holding her grandmother's hand, the same hands that had once trembled from hunger and fear. She reached out, running her fingers gently over the engraved words at the base. Hope begins in the smallest places. She turned to Bryan, her voice quiet but certain. I can't believe this all started with a cardboard sign. Bryan smiled, his gaze locked on the monument. No, he said softly. It started with the courage to believe in something better. Emma's eyes shimmered with emotion. Then we can't stop now. Bryan nodded. No, Emma, we won't. The legacy of hope. Years later, Hope for the Forgotten had reached millions of people. Over 20 million people had gained access to clean drinking water. More than 10,000 impoverished communities had been rebuilt. Children who had once struggled to find food were now receiving education and health care. At the 10-year anniversary celebration, thousands gathered in Washington, D.C. to commemorate the movement's success. As Bryan took the stage, he looked out at the massive crowd. He saw families who had been saved, children who had once been homeless, but now had futures filled with possibility. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion. We don't do this for praise or recognition. He paused, scanning the crowd. We do this because it's our responsibility. Then he turned to Emma, now standing beside him. She had grown into a leader, an activist, a beacon of hope. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said, Your journey is just beginning, Emma. Keep spreading hope. Emma smiled, determination gleaming in her eyes. I promise I won't stop. The story of Martha, Emma, and Bryan Cranston wasn't just a feel-good story. It was a call to action. This wasn't about one celebrity. It wasn't about one in-law, one little girl. It was about all of us. Because for every Emma, there are thousands of other children waiting for someone to stop, to listen, to care. They may not be holding cardboard signs. They may not be standing on a busy street corner. But their pain is real. Their struggles are real. And the difference between despair and hope is one person willing to stop and make a change. Emma's story is proof that even the smallest act of kindness can spark something greater than we ever imagined. One moment, one decision, one person willing to stop and listen. It changed everything. But there are still so many out there waiting for someone to notice them. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and be part of the change. Together, we can make sure no one is forgotten.